Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and as you can see, I've already got one of my worm bins all set to go, ready to be fed, and I've even got my glove on. I just figured we'd really quick go over this little information board. It tells us some information about the two systems we're going to be feeding. I've got two systems that are sort of sister bins or brother bins, however you want to think about it, twin bins. They're both the same age. They were both launched off on the same day, 178 days ago, and they're occupied by what I believe are African nightcrawler worms that I received way back when, years ago, from the crazy worm lady when she was still in the business of selling worms. And when we launched these systems off back then, at the day of launch, we had collectively, with input from you guys, the viewers in the comments, established a number of guesses, which I averaged, and the average number of worms populating these systems is almost 1,800 worms per bin. And after this much time, you would have to assume that these worms have been mating and reproducing, possibly even increasing that number there. Or who knows, it could have gone the other way, you never know. But these systems have now been fed 16 times. I've got some food here with which I plan to administer the 17th feeding. You can see I've got a number of these coffee filters here too. I've even got a couple off here on the side that I was going to reserve as replacement feeding zone indicators, because I usually use those coffee filters, as you can see right here, as an indicator to show where we last fed. Although, I usually feed down the middle, so it's not too much of a mystery as to where the last feeding was applied. It's more of a tradition, I would say. So I think I mentioned earlier, 10 days have passed now since the last time we checked in and fed these bins. But since what they received was a bunch of frozen pumpkin bits, my hunch is that after 10 days, we're probably not going to see a whole lot of leftovers of that. So the other thing that now stems back to 41 days ago was a feeding of some raw potato peels. And the potato peels actually had a number of chits growing out of them already, those little sprouts that you see sometimes on somewhat older potatoes that have been sitting around for a while. And those chits were growing like crazy. And even up until the last check-in, we saw signs of the potato growth continuing, persisting in these bins out of those raw potato peels. And, I guess usually I broke my sort of typical routine of freezing all the worm bin food prior to giving it to the worms, but this particular time I had not frozen it. And that's what happens, I guess, sometimes. Certain types of materials that you put in the worm bin with the intention of the worms eating them are very persistent and want to grow. In fact, right here I can see a little sprout of something which I assume is probably originating from a piece of potato peel. Although I could be wrong, it could just be something growing from a seed, which is fine. You see that sometimes, because you got some nice moisture going on here, some nice medium that the plants really like to grow in. And whether or not this is potato, I can't say for sure. I mean, at the moment I don't see anything else peeking through the surface, so maybe at least in this bin we've seen the end of the potato growth. It's about time. It's been going for a while. But every time we would bump into a piece of potato peel that was still exhibiting growth, we would try to snap it in half at very least. At very least we would always snap off the growth, and then if possible we'd try to break that piece of potato peel that seemed like it still had, the potential for growth. We would snap it as much as we could to try to break it down to the point where it'll actually begin decomposing rather than trying to continue growing. So if we see little chunks of orange, then we'll know that that might just be leftovers from the pumpkin they got last time. So I mean, you can see how well some of this potato peel is still holding out. When I snap it in half, it even has a little bit of a pop to it, because it's still holding up so well, still full of moisture. I just can't seem to resist wanting to snap it before it starts to grow again. Although, if it hasn't grown till now, maybe that's the end of the story. But I don't want to count my chickens before they hatch. If it's going to keep growing, then it's going to keep growing, and we'll keep seeing signs of it. But But right now it's kind of nice to see that there was only one little something popping out of the surface here, attempting to grow, but something that I couldn't really pin down as necessarily being potato peel. Could have been something else. Some sort of a seed or who knows what. So we've already bumped into a couple chunks of corn cob. That's this piece here, as well as these smaller bits, and a couple of things which I'm identifying as banana stem. Pretty sure that that's what those are. So far, well, you know what? Could this be a little chunk of... Could be, just based on its color. That could just be a little itsy bitsy leftover from the last feeding. Little piece of pumpkin. I really don't expect to see much pumpkin left over usually. Unless, of course, it's a stem. This stem, who knows how long it's been in here. But I would have to venture to guess that it's going to remain in here for quite a while before it breaks down. Once in a while I'm a little bit rough and I snap something like that, which I would normally just prefer to leave so that we can observe how it gradually breaks down on its own without our help. But that one seems to be holding together. More banana stem, but here it's kind of one of those connecting points on the bunch where all the stems hang off. It's always full of castings, and there's always a few worms hanging out down in the stuff, working it down. So that's definitely something that they enjoy. But it's a little bit tougher, you know, because of that butt end where it's much tougher, much harder material. But you know, in time, everything goes. Certain things just take a little bit longer than others. Alright, so, I mean, we did what we usually do, which is we kind of examine leftovers and chit-chat about them. And I'm sure we'll bump into a few more as I continue excavating. I can continue to try to, you know, identify them. This corn cob, another banana peel stem. But I want to start talking about how I wanted to assemble today's feeding. I thought we would kind of do what some people refer to as sort of a lasagna, stacking or layering of the food, where the food gets layered between pieces of bedding type materials. And most often people will use cardboard for that. But since I had a number of these coffee filters starting to pile up, I thought that maybe the layers in between the lasagna stack would just be pieces of coffee filter. So, but you know, you saw the size of the coffee filter. It's about the size of my extended palm of my hand. So if we want to do that, we need to open up a big enough opening down here to make that fit easily. And you know, I guess one of the layers could even just consist of a whole bunch of leftovers. I wonder if that would be best saved for the very top as the final layer, or if we should begin on the very bottom with that. I don't know. I guess we've got a moment or two to think that through and decide. But I think we've got a large enough space here in which we can assemble something like that right down the middle. But you know what, let's let these worms settle down really quick, dive down, get out of view, and then we'll proceed with the assembly of their lasagna stacked feeding. Well, I think I've made my decision, and we're going to place these leftover bits down into the lowest reaches of the bin, stacking the newer things closer to the surface. I don't know, sometimes when I see a worm that just doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot, see, it was just sleeping. I don't know, a lot of these worms, you know, don't like to be out in the bright lights, and that's just sort of a natural response because it's, you know, they're preserving their lives. You know, if they're out in the bright sunlight, they could be dried out by the bright sunlight and the heat, or even they could be spotted by a hungry bird, might swoop down and eat them. So it makes good sense for worms to avoid being out in the daylight. So when they don't react to being in the bright lights, you know, not to say that my wormery lights here are as bright as the daylight, but usually it's enough to cause worms to not want to be out in the light, and dive down. So when I see worms kind of just chilling out and not reacting to the lights, I start to wonder if they're still with it, you know. So that's a pretty good amount of, usually I'll spread the food out a little bit better across the whole width of the bin. But since we're kind of creating a stacked layer cake here, or lasagna, whatever you want to call it, I guess since it's round, it almost does look more like a stacked layer cake. But yeah, I guess I'm sort of focusing it down the middle. So I've got, what do we got? I just reused what was the feeding zone indicator. I've already set one aside here on the table to be our replacement feeding zone indicator. So I think we'll use this one and this one for stacking up the layers. And then the foods they're getting are just a variety of different stuff. There's a whole lot of lettuce bits here. This is even maybe the butt end of the head of lettuce. Unless it's cabbage? No, I believe it is lettuce. And then down here there was just a whole bunch of other small bits of stuff. Cucumber, peel, carrot, perhaps other stuff that was utilized in the making of that salad. So that looks to me like a pretty yummy second layer for this cake. Let's bring this in here. Oop. What did I just do? I just robbed the other system of its layer, because the one we set aside over here was really intended to go into here. And now, what else do I have here? I guess I got a few more bits of, oh my goodness, I only have one of these. Who gets it? Might as well give it to these guys. What a bonus. I guess maybe because there was this big bruise or something on the side of it, maybe this became worm food based on that. I don't think there's another big chunk like that. So that's sort of a bonus that this system's going to receive. And then on top of that, we're going to apply half of this pretty generous quantity of coffee that I bought down here to feed. And that seems like a pretty blah layer compared to what's down below as far as variety goes, right? So I've been just using my worm chow to try to make the coffee a little bit less boring. And I definitely don't want to come back in here next time and just find a big stack of coffee that was not touched by the worms. So I've been doing my best to make it a little bit more interesting for them so that they eat it all up for me. And what do we got left here? I've got 1, 2, 3 to be used as the layers, and then this one was set aside to be our feeding zone indicator. So let's cover up the feeding zone. I think that's really all we intended to do as far as feeding here. A little bit different in terms of just focusing it down the middle instead of utilizing the whole width of the container. And I guess as we cover up here really quick, we can maybe make sure we didn't miss too many chunks of leftovers that we might have stacked up over here on this side, and sort of bury them down into the feeding area as well. Let me just give the outer edges a quick till as well, because I feel a little bit of dry material out here on the surface, which I'd prefer to see submerged and give that an opportunity to get worked down a bit by the worms too, rather than remaining dry out on the surface. And you know, with the way things are covered in this bin, there is going to be a little bit of drying around the plastic covering, but everything that's covered with plastic will remain nice and damp with that moisture recirculating underneath it. I forget which channel where usually I just envision that as condensation and precipitation. And I guess one of the other worm channels refer to that recirculation of the moisture as reflection. So the moisture trying to, you know, exit the bin through evaporation is basically being reflected back down into the bin. So for some people that might just be an easier way to conceptualize what's happening there, but I guess the concept of, you know, water vapor and water vapor condensing on things is pretty much a common enough occurrence out in nature that we see it regularly enough that we can relate to it quite well. So that's our feeding of bin number 1. Let's bring back the plastic covering. And since this is a somewhat wider container than the other one that we're going to feed next, it doesn't quite get covered on the edges over here or over here because it is a little bit wider, but the other bin covered with the same exact type of plastic bag, I believe, is a little bit better covered. But luckily things aren't getting too dry on these edges. That's why I like to start in though, just to keep things damp if possible. Alright, on to bin number 2. Alright, really quick, I'm taking bets. Who thinks there's going to be growth in here? And who thinks there's not going to be any growth? This is the reveal. Let's see what we get. I mean, if you've been with me in the previous check-ins of these systems, I have been pretty persistent in trying to knock this stuff down every time I see it. And even if what we saw earlier in the other bin was growing out of a seed, which is really what it looked like to me, then we might have actually finally gotten to the point where all those potato chits are done growing, which is kind of nice. Been looking forward to the day that we can make that statement. So yeah, you can see much better coverage all the way out, all around the edges, right to the point where the moisture level out here on the edge is pretty much the same as over here, right in the center over where the feeding was applied. So kind of nice. Almost makes me wonder if we would benefit in this system by allowing for a little bit of airflow around the plastic bag covering, because I don't want to get things too damp in any of my bins. And that last feeding of pumpkin, frozen pumpkin, which really does eject a good bit of moisture after it's been thawing, could have actually taken the moisture level in the system to be a little bit more than we would want it to be. I don't know. Yeah, it might be a good idea is just to be a little bit more, a little bit sloppy, if you will, with the return of that plastic covering to allow for maybe just a little bit of airflow. Because look at this stuff. It is starting to get a little bit muddy and clumpy, which I'm sure the worms enjoy. You could see the worms really hanging out in it and mobbing around in there. Or maybe that's because of the yummy pumpkin that had been placed in here. Or a combination of both of those factors. So maybe there would be a little bit of a benefit to allowing this system to ventilate a little bit, sort of like the other system is doing just by nature of having a covering that doesn't go edge to edge as it does here. And then once in a while we'll have a little bit of dry material out on the surface, which we can blend in later. So here I believe this is the bin where we had the pumpkin stem, which was accidentally shattered by me at one point by me rough handling it. So I don't know if this is a chunk of it as well. I can't remember. I think it was in three separate pieces which we've made an attempt to keep near each other so that they'd be easy to locate. When we bump into one, we would know that the other chunks are nearby, and this would be the third small piece. No, this is a banana stem. This might have been the small piece, so there might be another somewhat larger medium-sized piece. If that's the baby bear, that's the papa bear, then there's a mama bear floating around in here somewhere, which we'll probably encounter because it would have been placed pretty close to the other two pieces. From what I remember, that was sort of the method I was following. Wow. Is that what I think it is? Could we have a piece of leftover pumpkin this large? Or is that just some sort of pumpkin look-alike? Pumpkin is just one of those things you don't expect to see a whole lot of leftovers of in the worm bin. But for whatever reason, seems like either the worms had a whole bunch of other whatever to focus their attention on, or maybe I just put a whole lot more in here. Maybe we've got fewer worms in here, although we started with what we thought to be an equal number of worms in both systems. There's no guarantee for, us having an exact population in both bins. Any one of a number of various things could have influenced faster or slower breeding in either of the systems. I don't know. I'm questioning whether we're going to bump into that last chunk of pumpkin stem. And I've told myself that I'm never, not going to want to go out of my way too much to try to track stuff like that down. Bumping into the leftovers of previous feedings is more of a kind of an incidental thing where getting the current feeding established and in there for them is the key priority. And if we run into stuff from days gone by that's more of, you know, informational kind of interesting stuff to see, you know, such as finding leftover bits of what appears to be pumpkin, where we found pretty much none in the other system. So that's a little bit of a oddity. But we're not going to go on some sort of a crazy mission to try to track down a piece of pumpkin stem or any other leftovers of pumpkin, even though it's a little bit unusual that we're seeing some in here. So yeah, I think we've done a good job excavating. Here again, I think we'll just give these little worms a moment to settle down before we apply today's feeding, and then we'll be finished here. Alright, I think we're going to do what we did earlier, is bring in the feeding zone indicator, since we've got a replacement for it, and create our foundational layer using it. Oh, these two little baby worms were stuck on my glove. So I was just noticing it right after I stepped away there for a moment. I was careful not to drop them, and then I got distracted and jumped right into the feeding here. So I do, you know, often try to avoid having that happen, you know, leaving worms just sitting there on my glove and then me allowing myself to get distracted and possibly dropping them on the floor or whatever. So luckily we didn't do any harm to those two little guys. So I don't know, I was just looking at the remaining bits of food that we have set aside here, allocated for this particular system. Just somehow seems like maybe more than what we gave the other bin, or maybe I just fluffed the whole package up a little bit and it looks that way because of that. Maybe it's just a whole bunch of lettuce leaves, which will probably be gone in a couple days anyway, so maybe I don't have to worry too much about a not so even distribution of the food here today. It does seem like quite a bit compared to the other bin. Also, I guess, becoming notable in my mind, at least to a certain point, due to the fact that, because we saw leftovers, you know, making me wonder if I'd be better off just not going overboard here and leaving this little bit of extra food here for something else. I do have some bait boxes going on in another system where I thought I might want to sweeten the deal a little bit, maybe use something like this stuff here to, yeah, you know what, I'm going to save this because we don't need it. I've still got a bunch of coffee I need to dispose of. And I just don't want to run out of room in here before we, you know, get rid of everything that we need to today for the feeding. So, there we go. Same story as before. I'm adding this worm chow to the coffee to try to make it into a somewhat more interesting food item for the worms to dive into. And this last coffee filter will become our feeding zone indicator. So here's just a few more things my fingers are sensing. A little piece of corn cob, I believe, another piece of corn cob. Just funny how your fingers become so accustomed to identifying some of these leftover foods that all you need to do is sort of bump into it and you already know what it is. I think with the corn cobs it's just par for the course because the stuff does sit around in the worm bins for so long that you're going to just run into it as leftovers for quite some time if you feed corn cob to your worm bins. I'm sure anybody else who's fed corn cob into their worm bins knows exactly what I'm talking about. So I can't remember now. I think we did a little bit of an excavation of the other side already, but I wanted to do the same here just to quickly inspect and aerate the material. And man, there are a lot of worms hanging out over here. How come they're not down in the feeding area getting rid of pumpkin? Whatever, it's their business. Alright. I can't recall. Did we till up the other edge or not? It feels that way. I just threw my fingers down into there, and it does feel a little bit more aerated than what I sensed when I excavated this side. So I think we're finished. Very nice. Well, almost finished. Finished from the video's perspective. I still got those little leftovers that I'm going to try to position over in my bait stations and some other bins that I've got going on, but that's an entirely different topic. I'm not going to mix into that topic here. We're just going to get things covered up and put away, but we're going to do so in a way that allows for a little bit of ventilation on this go around, I believe. I believe there is a little bit of benefit to letting some stuff dry, and the next time we come in here we'll be able to mix in that somewhat drier material with the rest of the stuff that feels perhaps a little bit overly damp, as a result bringing the overall moisture content of the system down to hopefully a level similar to what we saw in bin number 1, which I think is pretty much on the money. Alright, I've got a few things to take care of, getting put away, cleaned up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.